Christmas in Arkansas, a season of joy, tradition, and celebration. But behind the festive lights and serene winter landscapes lies a darker side, filled with ghostly encounters and eerie tales, from haunted lighthouses to cursed warehouses, and shadowy figures under moonlit trees. Tonight we'll uncover 10 chilling Christmas ghost stories that will send shivers down your spine. So, grab a warm drink, settle in, and prepare to explore the haunted holiday history of the natural state. Story number 1. The Woman in Red on Main Street. Main Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, comes alive every holiday season with festive lights and cheerful decorations. Families stroll down the brightly lit avenue, enjoying the holiday spirit and seasonal festivities. Yet, for decades, a chilling legend has haunted the otherwise jubilant street. Locals speak in hushed tones of a woman in a flowing red dress who appears every Christmas Eve. Her beauty is as striking as the sorrow etched into her face. Witnesses claim that as they approach, her form dissolves into the icy winter air, leaving behind only a profound sense of loss. For journalist Evelyn Carter, the story of the Woman in Red was irresistible. Known for her investigative reporting on urban legends, Evelyn had made a name for herself debunking or occasionally validating the strange and unexplained. When she heard about the specter of Main Street, she booked a trip to Little Rock, determined to uncover the truth. You'll want to stay close to the corner of Main and 5th. A local historian named Gerald told her over coffee. That's where most people see her. Midnight is when she appears. And what's the story behind her? Evelyn asked, her notebook open and pen poised. Gerald hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window. They say she was a socialite in the 1920s. Her name was Clara Davenport. She was engaged to a man named James Worthington, prominent banker, but something happened. She was found dead on Christmas morning, floating in the Arkansas River. Some say it was suicide. Others think he trailed off. Think what? Evelyn pressed. That he killed her, Gerald said. But nothing was ever proven, and every Christmas Eve, she's seen walking the street, as if searching for something or someone. Evelyn set up her equipment on the corner of Main and 5th that evening. The street was quiet, most residents home with their families. Snow fell in delicate flakes, dusting the pavement and muffling the sounds of the city. Evelyn's camera was trained on the street, and her recorder captured the ambient noise. She sipped hot coffee from a thermos, glancing at her watch. 11:45 p.m. As midnight approached, Evelyn's anticipation grew. She scanned the street, her breath visible in the cold air. Then, precisely 12:01, she saw her. The woman emerged from the shadows at the far end of the street. Her dress was a deep crimson, flowing like liquid fire in the moonlight. She moved gracefully, her steps silent against the snow. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she adjusted her camera, capturing every detail. The woman's face was pale, framed by dark curls that cascaded over her shoulders. But it was her expression that struck Evelyn most. A mixture of longing and despair that seemed to radiate from her very being. Evelyn took a cautious step forward. "Clara?" she called, her voice soft but steady. The woman stopped. Slowly, she turned to face Evelyn. For a moment, their eyes met, and Evelyn felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Grief so intense it left her breathless. Clara's lips moved, forming words Evelyn couldn't hear. Then, as Evelyn took another step, the woman began to fade. Her form shimmered like heat waves before dissolving into the cold night air. A gust of wind swept past, carrying the faint scent of roses. Shaken but resolute, Evelyn reviewed her footage back at her hotel. The camera had captured Clara's figure perfectly. The red dress, the sorrowful expression, the moment she vanished. But there was more. In the final seconds of the recording, another figure appeared behind Clara, a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by shadows. He seemed to reach for her just as she disappeared. The discovery sent Evelyn back to the archives. She pored over old newspapers and court records, piecing together Clara's story. The engagement between Clara Davenport and James Worthington had been a high society affair, widely covered in the papers. But in the weeks leading up to Christmas 1923, rumors of arguments and infidelity began to surface. Clara had been seen weeping outside a gala the night before her death. Witnesses reported seeing James following her onto Main Street shortly afterward. Evelyn's research led her to the Arkansas River. Standing on its banks, she imagined Clara's final moments. Was she pushed? Did she jump? The truth remained elusive, buried beneath decades of silence and snow. But as Evelyn gazed at the water, she felt a presence behind her. Turning quickly, she saw nothing but the empty shoreline. Yet the air felt charged, as if someone had been there moments before. Evelyn's article on the woman in red captivated readers, reigniting interest in the decades-old mystery. The footage she captured became the centerpiece of her story, sparking debates among skeptics and believers alike. But Evelyn knew there was more to the tale, something she couldn't fully explain. Every Christmas Eve, she returned to Main Street, hoping to see Clara again. And each year, as the clock struck midnight, she felt a chill in the air and caught the faint scent of roses, a reminder of the woman who walked the street, searching for peace she had yet to find. Story number 2. The piano in the abandoned restaurant. In Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a long-abandoned restaurant sits at the edge of the town. Its once grand facade now a crumbling reminder of its glory days. The sign above the entrance, chipped and faded, reads crescendo. Decades ago, it had been a hub for fine dining and live music, a place where couples danced to the hauntingly beautiful melodies of its resident pianist, George Whitman. But tragedy struck one Christmas Eve in 1957 when George collapsed mid-performance, his final notes echoing through the room. The restaurant closed soon after, and George's piano was left behind, gathering dust in the decaying building. For years, locals whispered of strange occurrences on Christmas Eve. Passers-by claimed to hear the piano's mournful tune floating out into the night. Though the restaurant had been locked and empty for decades, some believed it was George's spirit, still playing his last song, trapped in the place where he met his end. For aspiring musician and skeptic Mark Reed, the legend of the haunted piano was too enticing to ignore. He had come to Pine Bluff to visit his parents for the holidays, but when he overheard the story at a local coffee shop, he decided to investigate. Armed with his phone, a flashlight, and a portable recorder, Mark made his way to Crescendo on Christmas Eve. "You're really going in there?" asked the barista, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mark shrugged. "It's just an old piano and some creaky floorboards, probably the wind making those sounds. I'll check it out and prove there's nothing to be scared of." The barista shook her head. "Just be careful. That place has a way of getting under your skin." The restaurant was a shadow of its former self. Mark pushed open the heavy door, his hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. His flashlight illuminated the interior, overturned chairs, broken tables, and walls covered in graffiti. But at the far end of the dining room, untouched by the decay, sat the grand piano. Its black lacquered surface gleamed faintly in the moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. Mark approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The piano's lid was propped open, its ivory keys yellowed with age but otherwise pristine. He reached out and pressed a key. The note rang out, sharp and clear, startling in the silence. Mark exhaled a shaky laugh. "Not so spooky," he muttered, pulling out his recorder. As the clock struck midnight, Mark began to hear it, a faint melody, barely audible, as if the piano were playing itself. He froze, his flashlight beam trained on the keys. They were still. The sound grew louder, filling the empty restaurant with a mournful tune. It was a song he didn't recognize, but its sorrowful beauty sent chills down his spine. "Hello?" he called. his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in heavy silence. Mark's heart pounded as he scanned the room, his flashlight darting over the shadows. And then, slowly, the piano began to play again. This time, the melody was disjointed, the notes jarring and uneven, as if the player's hands were trembling. Mark backed away, his recorder still running. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath forming in the dim light. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye, and when he turned, he saw him, a man sitting at the piano, his back to Mark. He wore a black suit, his posture rigid, his hands moving fluidly over the keys. But something was wrong. The man's movements were too fast, too jerky, as if he were struggling to control the melody. "George," Mark whispered, the name slipping out before he realized it. The figure stopped playing. Slowly, he turned his head, revealing a face pale as death, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and when he spoke, his voice was low and hollow. "Do you hear it?" George asked. "Do you hear my song?" Mark stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken chair. What do you want?" he stammered. George's smile faded, replaced by an expression of anguish. "They never listen," he said. "But you hear it, don't you?" The room erupted into chaos. The piano keys slammed down in rapid succession, creating a cacophony of sound. The walls seemed to vibrate, the air thick with a cold, oppressive energy. Mark's flashlight flickered, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for the recorder, clutching it tightly as he bolted for the door. Behind him, the music grew louder, the melody twisting into something sinister. He reached the door and shoved it open, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Back at his parents' house, Mark reviewed the recording. The audio was clear, the mournful melody, the disjointed notes, and the voice, George's voice. "Do you hear it? Do you hear my song?" Mark released the recording as part of a podcast, sparking renewed interest in the Crescendo restaurant. Paranormal investigators and thrill-seekers flocked to Pine Bluff, but none captured evidence as compelling as Mark's. Still, he refused to return. The memory of George's twisted smile and the chaos of that night haunted him. Every Christmas Eve, he thought of the piano and the man who played it, wondering if George was still there, waiting for someone to truly hear his final song. Story number 3. The Mysterious Lights of Mount Magazine. Mount Magazine, the highest peak in Arkansas, stands as both a beacon of natural beauty and a harbinger of eerie legends. With its rugged cliffs, dense forests, and sweeping vistas, the mountain has drawn adventurers and nature lovers for centuries. But beneath its serene exterior lies a darker tale, the legend of the blue lights. Every Christmas Eve, locals claim to see ghostly orbs glowing in the forest, flickering and dancing like will-o'-the-wisps. Some say they're the spirits of climbers who lost their lives to the mountain's treacherous paths. Mason Harper had always been drawn to the unexplained. As a freelance journalist specializing in paranormal phenomena, he had trekked across the country chasing whispers of ghosts, cryptids, and UFOs when he heard about the lights of Mount Magazine. He knew he had to see them for himself. "You're heading up there on Christmas Eve?" the park ranger asked, raising an eyebrow as Mason signed the visitor log. "Brave. Most folks stay away this time of year." "That's exactly why I'm here," Mason replied, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "What can you tell me about the lights?" The ranger hesitated. "Some say it's just swamp gas or reflections from the stars, but others..." His voice trailed off, and he glanced toward the forest. "Others think it's something more. People have disappeared up there. You know, experienced climbers, good people. And then there's the lights." Mason pressed him for more details, but the ranger just shook his head. "Be careful. The mountain doesn't always welcome visitors. The trail to the summit was steep and winding, the air growing colder with each step. Snow clung to the branches, muffling the sounds of the forest. By the time Mason reached the clearing near the peak, the sun had set, leaving the landscape bathed in silvery moonlight. He set up his camera on a tripod, its lens trained on the forest below. Pulling out a thermos of coffee, he settled in to wait. Hours passed, the cold seeping into his bones. Just as he began to doubt the legend, he saw it. A faint blue glow flickered between the trees. First, Mason thought it was his imagination, a trick of the light, but the glow grew brighter, splitting into several orbs that floated silently through the forest. They moved with an almost sentient grace, weaving between the trunks and hovering above the snow. Mason grabbed his camera, adjusting the focus to capture the phenomenon. The orbs danced in and out of view, their light casting eerie shadows on the ground. But as he watched, a new sound emerged, a faint, mournful wail, carried on the wind. His breath hitched. The sound wasn't mechanical or animalistic. It was human, gathering his courage. Mason grabbed his flashlight and descended into the forest. Following the lights, the air grew colder as he moved deeper into the woods, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The orbs seemed to lead him, drifting ahead and pausing as if waiting for him to catch up. The wailing grew louder, interspersed with whispers he couldn't quite make out. "Hello," Mason called, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The whispers stopped. The lights hovered in place, their glow intensifying. Then, without warning, they surged forward, disappearing into a dense thicket. Mason hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but curiosity pushed him onward. The thicket opened into a small clearing, its center dominated by a jagged rock formation. The lights circled the rocks, illuminating something that made Mason's blood run cold. A pile of climbing gear, rusted and decayed, scattered across the snow. Ropes, carabiners, and boots lay haphazardly, some half buried in the ground. And then he saw the figures. They emerged from the shadows, their forms translucent and glowing faintly blue. Men and women in climbing attire, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They moved slowly, their heads turning as if searching for something or someone. Mason's flashlight flickered, and the air grew impossibly cold. One of the figures turned to him, his gaze locking onto his mouth open, and the wailing began again, louder and more piercing than before. "Help us," it whispered, the words barely audible over the din. Mason stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The lights grew brighter, the figures advancing toward him. Panic set in, and he turned, running blindly through the forest. When Mason finally emerged from the woods, his breath came in ragged gasps. The lights were gone, the wailing silenced. He collapsed near his camera, clutching at the ground to steady himself. The footage he captured that night was both haunting and inconclusive. The lights were clear, their movements deliberate, but the figures were faint, their outlines blurred. The audio, however, was undeniable. The wailing, the whispers, and the chilling plea for help. Mason's article about Mount Magazine's mysterious lights became a sensation. Skeptics dismissed it as fabrication, but others, those who had seen the lights themselves, reached out to share their stories. Many claimed to have lost loved ones on the mountain, their fates unknown. Mason never returned to Mount Magazine, but every Christmas Eve, he thought of the lights and the voices that had called to him from the darkness. And as snow blanketed the peak, locals swore the lights still appeared, flickering like spectral beacons, a reminder of those who had never made it down the mountain. Story number 4. The Man Under the Old Oak Tree, Scott County, Arkansas, is home to rolling hills and dense forests, a landscape seemingly untouched by time. But nestled deep within the woods stands an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. Known simply as the Hanging Tree, it carries a dark legacy. In the late 1800s, It served as the site of an execution. A man accused of murder was hanged there on Christmas Eve. Decades later, locals whisper of a ghostly figure seen swinging from its branches on the anniversary of his death. Thomas Keene, a historian and skeptic, arrived in Scott County on December 23rd. His latest project was a book on infamous legends of the South, and the hanging tree's tale intrigued him. Unlike the usual ghost stories, this one had historical documentation: the execution of Silas Granger, a drifter accused of killing a local merchant. Granger had maintained his innocence to the end, cursing the town and promising they'd regret their verdict. "You don't really believe you'll see him, do you?" asked Marla, the owner of the bed and breakfast where Thomas was staying. Thomas chuckled, sipping his coffee. "I've spent years chasing legends, Marla. So far, the ghosts haven't shown themselves." Marla's expression darkened. "The hanging tree's different. People have seen him, and the ones who go looking don't always come back right." The tree wasn't easy to find. Armed with a map and flashlight, Thomas trudged through the forest as dusk fell. The air was sharp with winter's chill, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound. When he finally reached the clearing, he stopped short. The oak tree was enormous, its branches spreading wide like the canopy of a cathedral. The trunk was thick and scarred, its bark blackened in places as if burned. A cold wind rustled its leaves. Though the forest around it was still, Thomas set up his camera and tripod, angling the lens toward the gnarled branches above. "All right, Silas Granger," he muttered. "Let's see if you're still around." The hours crept by. The forest grew darker, the shadows deeper. Thomas recorded the tree from every angle, narrating the history of Granger's trial and execution. Midnight approached, and he began to doubt the legend. Just another ghost story, he thought, and began packing his equipment. And then he saw it. A figure hung from the lowest branch, its form swaying gently in the wind. The man wore tattered clothes, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, the rope around his neck taut and frayed. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure's features were obscured by shadow, but as Thomas stepped closer, the man's face emerged from the darkness. It was gaunt and pale, the skin stretched tight over the bones. The eyes, though lifeless, seemed to stare directly at Thomas. The mouth opened, and a low, guttural sound escaped. A mix of a groan and a sigh that sent chills down Thomas's spine. "Who are you?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to twist and turn, as if the wind had picked up, though the forest remained eerily still. The groaning grew louder, accompanied by a faint creaking from the branch above. Thomas stumbled back, his camera forgotten as his instincts screamed at him to run. But he didn't. Instead, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it on the tree. The light passed through the figure, illuminating the rope and the branch, but casting no shadow. It wasn't solid, couldn't be real, and yet it moved. The figure's head snapped toward Thomas, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. The groaning stopped, replaced by a voice that was deep and hollow, as if it came from the earth itself. "They hanged the wrong man." Thomas staggered back, his pulse racing. "Granger?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to rise, the rope pulling it higher into the branches. The forest around the tree darkened, the shadows creeping closer. The air grew colder, and Thomas felt a pressure on his chest, as if the forest itself were closing in on him. "Leave," the voice commanded. "Leave before it takes you." Too. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted through the forest. The wind howled, and he thought he heard footsteps behind him. But he didn't dare look back. When he finally reached his car, he threw his gear inside and sped away, not stopping until he was back at the bed and breakfast. Marla was waiting for him, her expression grim. "You saw him, didn't you?" Thomas nodded. his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. He spoke to me, said they hanged the wrong man. Marla's eyes widened. You're lucky. Most people don't get a warning. The footage Thomas captured that night was both chilling and inconclusive. The figure was visible, but its form flickered and distorted, as if the camera couldn't fully process what it was seeing. The audio, however, was clear. The groaning, the creaking rope, and the words, they hanged the wrong man. Thomas published his account in a small journal. Accompanied by the footage, skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, but locals knew better. The hanging tree's curse was real, and Silas Granger's spirit would not rest until his name was cleared. Every Christmas Eve, the townsfolk avoid the forest, leaving the oak tree to its ghostly guardian. And those who dare to venture near know to heed the warning. Leave before it takes you. 2. Story number 5. The Man Under the Christmas Tree at Statehouse Park. Little Rock Statehouse Park was a beloved winter destination. Each year, a towering Christmas tree was erected in the center of the park, its branches adorned with glittering ornaments and strings of colorful lights. Families would gather beneath its boughs, snapping photos and sharing holiday cheer. But for all its charm, the tree carried a darker legend. A tale whispered among locals about a mysterious man who appeared beneath it on Christmas Eve. The story always ended the same way. As onlookers approached, the man vanished, leaving behind a trail of footprints leading to the river. For Rachel Sullivan, a true crime podcaster with a penchant for the paranormal, the legend of the Statehouse Park tree was too intriguing to ignore. Her show, Ghosts of the South, had gained a cult following, and she was always on the lookout for chilling tales to captivate her audience. This year, she decided to spend Christmas Eve in Little Rock, determined to uncover the truth behind the man beneath the tree. You really think you're going to see him? Her friend and co-producer, Daniel, asked as they set up their equipment near the park bench closest to the tree. Rachel smirked. If he's real, we'll catch him on camera. And if he's not, we still get a great story for the podcast. The park was quiet, its usual bustle subdued by the cold. The tree's lights cast a warm glow on the snow-covered ground, and the occasional crunch of footsteps from passing couples broke the silence. Rachel and Daniel settled in, their microphones ready, cameras trained on the tree. Midnight came and went without incident. Rachel began to wonder if the legend was nothing more than a tall tale. She was about to call it a night when Daniel nudged her, pointing toward the tree. There, he whispered. A figure stood beneath the branches. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat and hat that cast shadows over his face. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped in front of him. Rachel squinted, trying to make out his features, but the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, obscuring his face. She grabbed her microphone. This is Rachel Sullivan, live from Statehouse Park. We're witnessing something incredible. There's a man standing beneath the Christmas tree, just as the legend describes. The man didn't move. He stood as still as the tree itself, his presence both unnerving and magnetic. Rachel's pulse quickened as she approached, her boots crunching on the snow. Hello? She called. Can you hear me? The man's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her. She took another step forward, but before she could get closer, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a set of footprints leading away from the tree. Rachel and Daniel followed the trail, their breath visible in the freezing air. The footprints were deep and deliberate, heading straight toward the river that bordered the park. As they neared the water, the tracks abruptly stopped. There's no way, Daniel muttered, shining his flashlight on the undisturbed snow around them. It's like he just disappeared. Rachel crouched by the last footprint, her fingers brushing the edge of the impression. The snow was cold and damp, but something else lingered there. A faint, metallic scent, like rusted iron. The next day, Rachel dove into the park's history. She scoured newspaper archives and local records, searching for any clue about the man beneath the tree. One story caught her attention. A tragedy from 1936. A man named Edward Harper had disappeared on Christmas Eve, leaving behind his wife and young son. Witnesses claimed to have seen him standing beneath the park's Christmas tree before walking toward the river. His body was never found. Rachel uncovered more accounts of similar sightings over the decades. Each story described the same figure, a man in dark clothing, standing beneath the tree before vanishing. The sightings always occurred on Christmas Eve, and the footprints always ended at the river. As she pieced the story together, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the man's appearances were more than a haunting. They felt like a ritual, a cycle repeating itself year after year. That night, she recorded her findings for the podcast, her voice steady despite the lingering chill in her bones. The man beneath the Statehouse park tree isn't just a ghost, she concluded. He's a reminder, a fragment of a story that refuses to be forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, he's still searching for something he lost. Rachel's episode became one of her most popular, sparking renewed interest in the legend. But she never returned to the park on Christmas Eve. The image of the man's shadowed face and the icy trail to the river stayed with her, a haunting memory she couldn't quite shake. And every year, as the holidays approached, she thought of the tree and the man who stood beneath it, waiting for someone to see him, to remember. Story number 6. The Ghosts of Newton County Mines. Newton County, Arkansas, is a place of rugged beauty, with its rolling hills and dense forests. But nestled deep within its wilderness lies a relic of its industrial past, the abandoned zinc mines. Once a bustling hub of activity, the mines now stand silent, their entrances overgrown and their depths shrouded in darkness. But locals whisper of strange happenings within the mine shafts, particularly on Christmas Eve. They tell of eerie blue lights flickering at the mine entrance and the ghostly sound of pickaxes striking stone, echoing from the earth itself. Charlie Mercer had heard the stories his entire life. As a child, he'd listened wide-eyed as his grandfather spoke of the miners who'd perished in collapses and accidents, their spirits forever tethered to the zinc veins they had worked so hard to extract. As an adult and an aspiring filmmaker, Charlie saw the mines as the perfect subject for his next documentary. "You're crazy to go out there," his friend Jake warned as they loaded equipment into Charlie's truck, especially on Christmas Eve. "You know what people say about that place?" Charlie shrugged, his grin lopsided. "That's exactly why I'm going. Legends don't film themselves." Jake shook his head. "Just don't go inside the mine. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, stay out of the tunnels." The drive to the mines took them deep into the heart of Newton County's wilderness. Snow dusted the trees, and the air was sharp with winter's chill. Charlie parked his truck near the overgrown trailhead, the path to the mines barely visible under years of neglect. As the two men trekked through the woods, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The entrance to the main shaft loomed ahead, a yawning black hole framed by crumbling stone. Charlie set up his camera, its lens trained on the mine's dark mouth. "All right," he said, flipping on his flashlight. "Let's see if the ghosts want to talk tonight." The first hour passed uneventfully. Charlie filmed the mine entrance while Jake scanned the area with an EMF meter, its needle stubbornly stuck at 0. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Then, at precisely midnight, the air changed. It started with a faint glow. Charlie noticed it first, a bluish light emanating from deep within the mine. He grabbed his camera, adjusting the focus to capture the strange illumination. The light pulsed, growing brighter, then dimmer, as if it were breathing. "You seeing this?" Charlie whispered, his voice tinged with awe. Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the EMF meter. The needle had begun to quiver, its movement erratic. "It's coming from inside," he said, his voice barely audible. The sound came next, the sharp, rhythmic clink of metal against stone. Charlie turned toward the mine, his camera trained on the entrance. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint echo of voices, gruff and unintelligible, yet unmistakably human. "That's impossible," Jake said, taking a step back. "No one's been down there in decades." Charlie, however, was undeterred. "Stay here," he said, slinging the camera over his shoulder. "I'm going in." "Charlie, no!" Jake grabbed his arm, his expression frantic. "We came to document, not to die." But Charlie was already moving, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound of pickaxes grew louder, the blue light brighter, as he ventured deeper into the mine. The tunnel walls were slick with moisture, their surfaces glinting faintly in the eerie blue light. Charlie's footsteps echoed as he descended, his breath visible in the frigid air. The sound of labor was all around him now, the scrape of shovels, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional shout of warning. He rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Ahead of him, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its walls shimmering with veins of zinc. Figures moved within the light, men in miners' garb, their forms translucent and glowing. They worked methodically, their pickaxes striking the stone in perfect rhythm. Charlie raised his camera, his hands shaking as he filmed. The miners paid him no mind, their focus entirely on their work. Then one of them turned. The man's face was pale and drawn, his eyes dark hollows that seemed to pierce straight through Charlie. He raised a hand, pointing deeper into the mine. Charlie followed the gesture, his flashlight revealing an old wooden cart filled with ore. Beside it lay a skeleton, its bony fingers still clutching a pickaxe. Charlie's breath hitched as the room grew colder. The blue light pulsed, and the miners stopped their work, turning in unison to face him. Their eyes glowed, their expressions unreadable. "What do you want?" Charlie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lead miner stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened his mouth, but the voice that emerged was not his own. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and discordant. "Leave!" Charlie turned and ran, the sound of pickaxes chasing him as he scrambled back up the tunnel. The blue light flickered and dimmed, and the whispers faded into the shadows. When he emerged into the night, Jake was waiting, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What the hell happened?" Jake demanded as Charlie collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. They're still down there," Charlie said, his voice shaking, "working, waiting." The footage Charlie captured that night became the centerpiece of his documentary, sparking debates and drawing attention to the abandoned mines. But he never returned to Newton County, and he avoided discussing the experience in detail. The memory of those glowing miners and their hollow eyes haunted him, a constant reminder of the lives lost in the dark depths of the earth. And every Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed the quiet forests of Newton County, the blue light flickered once more, and the sound of pickaxes echoed from the forgotten tunnels, a chilling reminder of the past that refused to rest. Story number 7. The Ghosts of Fort Smith Hospital. The old Fort Smith Hospital had stood abandoned for decades. Its once pristine walls were now cracked and peeling, the windows shattered, and the surrounding grounds overgrown with weeds. Built in the late 19th century, it had served as a beacon of hope during some of the darkest times, from outbreaks of cholera to the influenza pandemic of 1918. But the hospital's history was not without tragedy, and its halls were said to echo with the whispers of those who had never left. Every Christmas Eve, locals whispered of strange occurrences in the crumbling building, footsteps in empty corridors, faint whispers in the dead of night, and the distant hum of hospital equipment long since removed. These stories had become a part of Fort Smith's folklore, passed down through generations. Megan Clark didn't believe in ghosts, a journalist specializing in uncovering the truth behind urban legends. She saw the hospital as just another crumbling relic of the past. When her editor suggested she investigate the Christmas Eve hauntings, Megan jumped at the chance. eager to add another debunked legend to her portfolio. "You're braver than most," the security guard said as he handed her the keys to the front gate. "No one stays in there after dark." "I'll be fine," Megan replied, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder. "It's just a building." The guard's expression darkened. "Just a building with a lot of history. Don't forget that." The hospital loomed before her, its silhouette stark against the gray winter sky. Megan pushed open the rusted gate and made her way inside. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. She set up her equipment in what had once been the main lobby. The peeling paint and broken furniture, a stark contrast to the holiday decorations that must have once adorned the space. By 10 p.m., Megan had explored much of the ground floor. Finding little more than graffiti and debris, she recorded her observations, noting the eerie stillness of the place but dismissing it as the natural atmosphere of an abandoned building. Then the footsteps began. First, they were faint, barely audible over the wind rattling the broken windows. Megan froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. The sound grew louder, distinct against the silence. Measured, deliberate steps echoing down the hallway. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. Megan grabbed her flashlight and aimed it down the corridor. The beam illuminated only dust motes swirling in the air. She took a deep breath and convinced herself it was just the building settling. But as she turned to continue her work, the whispers started, soft and indistinct. The whispers seemed to come from all around her. Megan strained to make out the words, but they eluded her, slipping away like smoke. She followed the sound to a staircase leading to the upper floors, her heart pounding as she climbed. The second floor was colder, the air biting against her skin. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the faint creak of old floorboards. Megan moved cautiously, her flashlight revealing a long hallway lined with patient rooms. Most of the doors were ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. As she reached the end of the hallway, she noticed one door that was closed. Faint light seeped out from beneath it, flickering like the glow of a distant candle. Megan hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity pushed her forward. She placed a hand on the doorknob, its cold metal sending a shiver through her. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old hospital bed and a cracked mirror on the wall. But the air felt charged, as if the space itself was alive. Megan stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping over the walls. In the mirror, she saw movement. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was no longer alone. A figure stood behind her, a nurse in a vintage uniform, her face pale and eyes hollow. The nurse raised a hand, pointing toward the bed. Megan turned, her flashlight revealing a faded stain on the mattress. Dark and rust-colored, the whispers grew louder. Now distinct words. "Why did you leave us?" Panic set in. Megan stumbled out of the room, her breath coming in short gasps. The hallway was no longer empty. Figures stood in the shadows, their forms faint and translucent. Patients in hospital gowns, nurses with weary expressions, and a doctor clutching a clipboard. They stared at her silently, their eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. Megan ran, her footsteps echoing as she fled down the stairs and out into the night. The whispers followed her, fading only when she reached the gate. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, and didn't stop running until she was safely back in her car. The next day, Megan reviewed her recordings. The audio captured the footsteps and whispers clearly, as well as her own frantic breathing. But the video was corrupted, the footage distorted and filled with static. The only clear frame was of the mirror, showing the nurse standing behind her, her hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. Megan's article on the Fort Smith Hospital became one of her most popular pieces, but she never returned to the building. The experience left her with a lingering sense of unease, a chill that stayed with her long after the holidays. And every Christmas Eve, When the night grew quiet and the world seemed to hold its breath, she thought of the whispers and the figures in the hallway, wondering if they were still waiting for someone to answer their call. Story number 8. The Ghost of DeGray Lake. DeGray Lake in Arkadelphia is a gem of natural beauty. Known for its serene waters and lush surroundings, it's a favorite destination for fishing, boating, and camping. Yet, beneath its tranquil surface lies a chilling legend, one that keeps locals wary of its shores on Christmas Eve. They speak of a woman in a flowing white dress who appears at the lake's edge, gazing into the water with an expression of profound sadness. Moments later, she vanishes, leaving only ripples on the water and a lingering sense of unease. Rachel Carter had heard the stories growing up in Arkadelphia, but she'd always dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. Now a journalist for a regional magazine, Rachel was tasked with writing a feature on local Christmas legends. Reluctantly, she returned to her hometown and decided to spend Christmas Eve at DeGray Lake, determined to debunk the tale of the ghostly woman. "You sure you want to do this?" her brother, James, asked as he dropped her off at the lake. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water. Rachel smirked. "It's just a story, James. I'll be fine." James hesitated. "People have seen her, Rach. They say she's looking for something or someone. Well, if she shows up, I'll ask her for an exclusive," Rachel joked, adjusting her backpack. But James didn't laugh. "Just be careful, okay?" The lake was eerily quiet as Rachel set up her equipment. A full moon rose above the trees, its light reflecting off the water. She placed her camera on a tripod near the shore, framing the scene perfectly. Her recorder was on, capturing the ambient sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Rachel paced along the shoreline, her breath visible in the cold night air. She checked her watch. 11:45 p.m. If the stories were true, the ghost would appear soon. She sat on a rock near the water's edge, staring out at the moonlit lake. The silence was oppressive, the stillness unnerving. Then, at exactly midnight, she saw her. A figure emerged from the mist that had gathered over the water. The woman wore a white dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Her hair was long and dark, cascading over her shoulders. She moved with an ethereal grace, her bare feet leaving no trace on the sandy shore. Rachel froze, her pulse quickening as the woman stopped a few feet from the water's edge. The ghost didn't seem to notice Rachel. Instead, she stared into the lake, her expression a mixture of longing and despair. Rachel grabbed her camera, snapping photos with trembling hands. Through the lens, the woman's features became clearer. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide with an emotion Rachel couldn't place. "Hello," Rachel called, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She took a step closer to the water, her reflection rippling in the lake. Then she began to hum. The melody was soft and mournful, carrying across the still night air. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as the tune grew louder, more insistent. Rachel's recorder captured every note, but the sound seemed to change as it reached her ears. It wasn't just music. It was a story, a plea for help. The ghost turned her head slightly, as if she'd heard Rachel, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. The sadness in the woman's gaze was overwhelming, and Rachel felt tears well up in her own eyes. Suddenly, the ghost pointed toward the water. Her humming stopped, replaced by a single word spoken in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the lake itself. "Help!" Rachel stood, her feet rooted to the spot. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice trembling. The ghost didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the lake, her figure dissolving into mist as the water closed over her. The ripples spread outward, reaching Rachel's feet before fading into the stillness. The next day, Rachel dove into the archives at the local library, searching for any clue about the woman's identity. She found a newspaper article from 1934 about a young woman named Eleanor Gray who had drowned in DeGray Lake on Christmas Eve. The article described Eleanor as a talented pianist who had been engaged to a local businessman. But the engagement had ended tragically when her fiancé disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Heartbroken, Eleanor had wandered to the lake, where she was last seen alive. Further research revealed rumors that her fiancé hadn't left willingly. Witnesses had reported seeing him arguing with a group of men near the lake the night he vanished. Some speculated he had been murdered, his body hidden in the lake. Rachel published her story, including the haunting photos and audio recording of the ghost song. The piece garnered national attention, drawing paranormal enthusiasts and investigators to DeGray Lake. Some claimed to see Eleanor themselves, while others dismissed the sightings as mass hysteria. But for Rachel, the encounter was deeply personal. Every Christmas Eve, she returned to the lake, standing at the shore where she'd first seen Eleanor. She listened for the melody, hoping to hear the ghostly hum again. And as the years went by, the legend of the woman in white grew. Locals continued to avoid the lake on Christmas Eve, leaving it to the restless spirit of Eleanor Gray, who still wandered the shores, searching for something or someone lost to the depths of DeGray Lake. Story number 9. The Cursed Warehouse of Stuttgart. On the outskirts of Stuttgart, Arkansas, a dilapidated warehouse sits in eerie isolation. Its rusted exterior and sagging roof make it an eyesore. But it's not the building's appearance that chills those who pass by. The townsfolk whisper of a curse, a sinister presence that lingers within its walls. Every Christmas Eve, the warehouse comes alive with the sounds of blood-curdling screams. Yet when brave souls investigate, they find nothing but silence and an overwhelming sense of dread. For urban explorer and amateur paranormal investigator Rachel Blake, the stories of the cursed warehouse were too tempting to resist. She had spent years documenting haunted locations across the South, and the thought of spending Christmas Eve in Stuttgart, Arkansas, sounded like the perfect way to end her year. "You're going to regret it," warned the elderly woman at the diner when Rachel stopped for a meal before heading out. "People who mess with that place don't come back the same." Rachel offered a polite smile, but she dismissed the warning as nothing more than local superstition. The warehouse's grim reputation had made it a favorite for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, and none of them had been seriously harmed. At least, not physically. The warehouse loomed in the distance as Rachel pulled her car onto the dirt road leading to the property. The December night was cold and clear, the stars twinkling above her like tiny shards of glass. She parked near the gate, grabbed her camera and flashlight, and approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the building. The lock on the gate had long since been cut, and the gate itself hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, and the smell of mildew and rust filled her nostrils. The warehouse was cavernous, its walls lined with forgotten machinery and broken crates. Her footsteps echoed ominously as she moved deeper into the building, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She set up her camera on a tripod near the center of the room and began to record. "This is Rachel Blake," she said into the lens, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I'm inside the Stuttgart warehouse, where locals claim to hear screams every Christmas Eve. Let's see if the stories are true." For the first hour, nothing happened. Rachel walked the perimeter of the warehouse, her camera capturing the peeling paint, graffiti-covered walls, and scattered debris. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of rodents in the shadows. She began to think the stories were nothing more than overactive imaginations. And then she heard it. The scream was distant at first, almost imperceptible, like a wail carried on the wind. Rachel froze, her heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the vast space. It was a sound of pure agony, raw and unrelenting. She grabbed her flashlight and turned toward the source, but the beam revealed nothing but empty air. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The only response was another scream, this one so close it felt like it was coming from inside her own head. Rachel staggered back, clutching her flashlight as the sound reverberated through the warehouse. Her camera's audio recorder picked up every chilling note, the wails piercing and unrelenting. The screams subsided as quickly as they had started, leaving Rachel in a deafening silence. She took a shaky breath and checked her camera to ensure it was still recording. When she glanced at the screen, her blood ran cold. The footage showed her standing alone in the center of the warehouse. But in the background, faint shadows moved across the walls. They didn't follow the natural patterns of her flashlight. Instead, they darted and twisted, like figures dancing just beyond the edge of the light. "What the hell?" she muttered, spinning around to search for the source of the shadows. There was nothing there. Determined to find an explanation, Rachel ventured deeper into the warehouse. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as she approached a set of metal stairs leading to the second level. The steps groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the top, she found a small office with shattered windows and a desk covered in dust. A single piece of paper lay in the center of the desk, its edges yellowed with age. The paper was a ledger, listing names and dates. Most of the entries were mundane, but one name was repeated over and over: Margaret Price. The dates next to her name spanned several years, all ending with the same note: unaccounted for. Rachel's flashlight flickered again, and the room was plunged into darkness. The screams returned, louder than ever, accompanied by the sound of pounding footsteps. They were coming up the stairs. Rachel fumbled for her flashlight, its beam sputtering to life just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The office was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The shadows on the walls began to move again, swirling and contorting into the shape of a woman. Her face was obscured, but her presence was undeniable. The air grew colder still, and Rachel felt a pressure on her chest, as if the darkness itself were trying to smother her. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural. The shadows surged toward her, and Rachel bolted, sprinting down the stairs and out of the warehouse. The screams followed her, growing fainter as she reached the safety of her car. Rachel never returned to the warehouse, but the footage she captured that night became the centerpiece of her documentary. The screams, the moving shadows, and the name Margaret Price sparked renewed interest in the building's dark history. Further research revealed that Margaret Price had been a worker in the warehouse during the 1930s. She had gone missing one Christmas Eve, her body never found. Locals believe her spirit remains trapped, her agony echoing through the warehouse every year. And while Rachel's documentary brought her acclaim, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had brought something back with her. A lingering chill that followed her, even in the warmth of her own home. Every Christmas Eve, as the clock struck midnight, Rachel thought of the screams and shadows in the Stuttgart warehouse, wondering if Margaret Price was still there, waiting for someone to hear her cries. Story number 10. The bells of the abandoned lighthouse, Eufaula's shoreline, with its tranquil waters and sprawling vistas, seems far removed from the chaos of urban life. But tucked away on a forgotten edge of the lake lies an old lighthouse, its once proud tower now crumbling and consumed by vines. Built in the late 19th century, the structure was abandoned after a devastating storm in 1910 claimed the life of its keeper, Thomas Grady. Since then, the lighthouse has become the subject of eerie tales. Every Christmas Eve, local fishermen claim to hear its bells toll and see its light flicker across the water. Though the building has been lifeless for over a century, Sam Tucker had heard the stories all his life. A lifelong resident of Eufaula, he had grown up on the lake, fishing its waters and exploring its hidden corners. Now in his 30s and chasing his childhood dream of being a paranormal investigator, he saw the lighthouse as an irresistible challenge. "I'm telling you," Sam, his friend and fishing buddy, Pete, warned as they prepared their boat on Christmas Eve. You don't mess with that place. Grady's still there, and he's not happy about visitors. Sam laughed, slinging his gear into the boat. Come on, Pete, it's an old story. Grady's probably just a tall tale parents used to scare their kids away from the lighthouse. And what about the bells? Pete shot back, his tone serious. You think we all just imagined it? Those bells don't ring themselves. Sam shrugged. Tonight, we're going to find out. The boat cut through the calm waters as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. By the time they reached the lighthouse, darkness had settled over the lake. The tower loomed above them, its silhouette stark against the starry sky. Sam felt a shiver run down his spine, though he'd never admit it. They tied the boat to the rusting dock, their flashlights piercing the thick gloom. The lighthouse door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind tugged at it. Sam pushed it open, revealing a spiral staircase that wound upward into the shadows. You coming? Sam asked, glancing back at Pete. Pete hesitated, his face pale. I'll wait down here. Someone's got to make sure the boat doesn't drift off. Sam smirked but didn't press. He climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew colder as he ascended, and an unsettling silence filled the tower, broken only by the distant lapping of water against the shore. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse was a relic of a bygone era. Dust-coated glass panes surrounded the space, and the rusted remains of the old lamp stood in the center. Sam set up his equipment, adjusting his camera and recorder. If anyone's here, he said aloud, his voice steady, show yourself. Let us know you're still watching over the lake. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, he heard it, a low, resonant toll, like the sound of a distant bell. Sam froze, his heart racing. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the lighthouse. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the tower. Pete, Sam called, his voice trembling. No response. The air in the room grew icy, frost forming on the glass panes. Sam's breath came out in visible puffs as he swung his flashlight toward the staircase. Footsteps echoed from below, slow and deliberate, climbing toward him. Pete, if this is your idea of a joke, it's not funny, Sam said, though he doubted Pete could fake the oppressive cold that now filled the room. The footsteps stopped just outside the door to the lantern room. Sam's flashlight flickered, and the bell tolled again, its mournful sound reverberating through the tower. Then the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and gaunt, cloaked in shadows. It wore a uniform, the brass buttons tarnished and dull. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes dark hollows that seemed to pull the light from the room. Thomas Grady, Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the lake. The bells tolled again, louder this time, as if demanding attention. Sam felt a pull, an unexplainable urge to look where Grady pointed. Through the frosted glass, he saw it, a small boat, capsized and bobbing in the water. Pete's shout from below snapped Sam out of his trance. Sam, get down here, now! Sam bolted down the stairs, his equipment forgotten. Pete stood at the dock, his flashlight trained on the lake. Did you see it? He asked, his voice frantic. Sam followed Pete's gaze. Floating near the shore was a second boat, half-sunken and encrusted with barnacles. Its wood was splintered, its shape unmistakably old. That wasn't there when we came, Pete said, backing away from the edge of the dock. Sam stared at the boat, his mind racing. He turned back to the lighthouse, its windows dark and lifeless. The bells had stopped, and the air felt warmer, as if whatever had been there had receded. The next day, Sam pored over historical records and local accounts. He found a report from 1910 detailing the storm that had claimed Thomas Grady's life. Grady had taken a rowboat out to guide a stranded vessel back to safety, but neither he nor the boat had ever returned. The wreckage had been lost to the lake, swallowed by its murky depths. Sam's footage from the lighthouse was inconclusive. The audio captured the tolling bells clearly, but the figure he'd seen was absent from the video. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Grady's spirit lingered, watching over the lake even in death. Every Christmas Eve after, Sam returned to the lighthouse, leaving a lantern on the dock as a tribute to the keeper who had never abandoned his post. And each year, as the clock struck midnight, the bells tolled once more, their mournful sound a reminder of the storm and the man who braved it. From mysterious lights in the forest to ghostly piano music echoing in abandoned halls, Arkansas's haunted Christmas stories remind us that the past often lingers in unexpected ways. Which of these tales sent chills down your spine? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more haunting stories and supernatural journeys. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, not all Christmas spirits bring joy.